The year is 1933. A train rolls out of New York toward Washington. Through the window, you see factory smokestacks standing silent. You see bread lines stretching for blocks. You see men in threadbare suits selling apples on street corners. We're taught that the Great Depression was about bank failures and stock crashes. We're told it was about bad luck and bad timing, but that's not the whole story. The real story is about who controlled the money and what they were willing to do to keep it. This isn't about ideology. This isn't about left versus right. This is about the balance sheet. And when the balance sheet tips too far in one direction, someone always tries to correct it, even if it means tearing down democracy itself. America in 1933 looked like the end of the world. 25% of men had no jobs. Families huddled in shanty towns made of cardboard and scrap metal. These settlements were called Hoovervilles, named after the president who watched it all happen. Children went to bed hungry. Fathers who once provided now stood in soup lines. The factories that built America sat empty and cold. The fields turned to dust because there was no market for crops. This was the richest nation on earth, and people were starving. The social contract had been shredded. The American dream looked like a cruel joke. But here's what the history books don't emphasize. While the masses suffered, the creditor class was terrified. The banks held bonds backed by gold. They held debt instruments worth millions. And Roosevelt had just done the unthinkable. In April 1933, he took America off the gold standard. He devalued the dollar to help farmers pay their debts, to help workers survive. But to the bondholders, this was theft. Their bonds lost half their value overnight. The men who owned America's debt watched their ledgers bleed red ink. They didn't see relief for the suffering. They saw their wealth evaporating. And they decided Roosevelt had to go. This is the story of the business plot, the conspiracy to overthrow the United States government, not with votes, not with speeches, with soldiers, with guns, with a march on Washington, and the installation of a fascist dictator. The plan was real. The money was ready. $3 million in working capital, commitments for $30 million more. In 1933, that was enough to buy an army, and they knew exactly who they wanted to lead it. His name was Smedley Darlington Butler, two-time Medal of Honor recipient, the most decorated Marine in American history, a warrior who had fought in the Philippines, China, Central America, and France. A man whose troops called him Old Gimlet Eye. A soldier who had spent 33 years serving the flag. But by 1933, Butler had experienced a conversion. He had looked back at his career with clear eyes, and he realized he hadn't been fighting for freedom. He had been an enforcer, a corporate mercenary. He had invaded Haiti to protect National City Bank's loans. He had invaded Nicaragua for Brown Brothers Investment House. He had invaded Honduras for the United Fruit Company. The flag followed the money. The soldiers bled for profit, and Butler started saying it out loud. He called war a racket. He said he'd been a gangster for capitalism. The establishment hated him for it, but the veterans loved him, and that made him valuable. In July 1933, a bond salesman named Gerald McGuire knocked on Butler's door. McGuire worked for Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company. Murphy sat on the boards of Goodyear and Bethlehem Steel. He was connected to the Guarantee Trust Company, part of the J.P. Morgan empire. McGuire came with a proposition. He said wealthy citizens wanted to help the veterans. He said they wanted Butler to speak at an American Legion convention. He said they wanted him to demand payment of the veterans' bonus in gold, not paper money. Then McGuire opened his briefcase. Inside was $18,000 in cash. In 1933, that was enough to buy a house. It was more than most men earned in 10 years. McGuire said it was for expenses, for boosters to pack the convention. Butler's instincts screamed warning. This wasn't about veterans. This was about gold, and gold meant Wall Street. Butler didn't refuse. He played along. He wanted to see how deep this went. Over the next months, McGuire visited repeatedly. He bought Butler fancy dinners, he flattered him, he courted him, and slowly, piece by piece, he revealed the real plan. McGuire explained that his bosses were furious about the gold standard. They held bonds worth millions. Roosevelt's devaluation had cost them half their wealth. They wanted Butler to mobilize the veterans as a political weapon, to force the government back onto gold, to restore their balance sheets. But it went deeper than that. McGuire started talking about Europe. He said his bosses had sent him on a research trip to Italy, to Germany, to France. He wasn't studying art. He was studying fascism. McGuire described a French group called the Croix de Feu, the Cross of Fire, a paramilitary organization of right-wing veterans. They had marched on the French Parliament. They were disciplined, armed, and loyal to conservative business interests. McGuire said America needed the same thing, a super-organization of veterans, an army that would protect property and profits, not accountable to the President or Congress, accountable to the men who paid them. He said they would recruit 500,000 soldiers. They would arm them with rifles from Remington Arms, controlled by the DuPont family. Everything was connected. Everything was in the family. Then McGuire said the words that revealed everything. They would march on Washington. They would surround the White House. They would tell Roosevelt his health was failing. They would propose a new cabinet position, Secretary of General Affairs. This secretary would hold all executive power. Roosevelt would remain president in name only. A figurehead who signed papers and waved at parades. Democracy would exist on paper, but the real power would belong to business, and McGuire looked Butler in the eye and said it plain. You will be the secretary. You will be the dictator. Butler felt rage building in his chest. This soft-sweating bond salesman was proposing treason, casually, like a business deal. Butler wanted to snap his neck right there. One quick movement, and this traitor would be silenced. But Butler was a strategist. Killing McGuire wouldn't stop the plot. They would just find another general. Someone like Douglas MacArthur, who had authoritarian tendencies. Someone who would say yes. Butler realized he had to become a spy. He had to gather evidence. He had to let the conspiracy unfold far enough to expose it completely, but not so far that it succeeded. So he lied. He said he was interested. The words tasted like poison, but he said he needed proof. He couldn't act on the word of a salesman. He needed to see the men at the top. He needed to see the money. McGuire arranged a meeting with Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, a millionaire many times over, a man who collected art and never worked a day in his life. They met at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gilded fixtures, a temple of wealth. Clark got straight to the point. He said he would spend half his fortune to save the other half. He said the gold standard was the only thing preventing chaos. He confirmed everything McGuire had said. He confirmed the money was available. He confirmed they were looking for a strong man. He even tried to bribe Butler right there in the lobby. He pulled out his checkbook. He offered to write a check for tens of thousands of dollars. Casual, matter of fact. Like buying a car. Butler refused. But he had what he needed, because he'd been smart. He'd brought a reporter named Paul Comley French, introduced him as his secretary. Clark and McGuire spoke freely in front of him. French took notes. He recorded everything, the names, the amounts, the plan, and he captured the most damning quote. McGuire had said without shame, "We need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists." There it was, the mask off. Fascism in America, funded by American millionaires. Butler had his evidence, but who could he tell? The police were controlled by politicians funded by these same men. The newspapers were owned by the industrialists. It was a closed system. If Butler went public the wrong way, they would destroy him. They would call him crazy, a paranoid soldier with shell shock. They would ruin his reputation and bury the truth. He needed a forum where he would be taken seriously, where lying was a crime, where the testimony would be official and documented. In November 1934, he contacted the House Un-American Activities Committee. He told them the real threat to democracy wasn't coming from Berlin or Moscow. It was coming from Wall Street, from men in three-piece suits in Manhattan boardrooms. The committee agreed to hear him, but they were terrified. If they went after Morgan and DuPont, they were attacking the most powerful men in America, men who could end political careers with a phone call. So they made a decision that haunts history. They held the hearings in secret, an executive session. No press, no cameras, no public record, just the general, the congressman, and the stenographer, hidden away where the truth could be spoken, but controlled. On November 20th, 1934, Butler walked into the committee room. He wore his best suit. He looked tired. The weight of what he carried had aged him, but his eyes were sharp, those famous gimlet eyes that had stared down death in a dozen battles. He placed his hand on the Bible. He swore to tell the truth. And then he spoke for 2 hours straight, his voice clear and steady. He named Gerald McGuire. He named Robert Sterling Clark. He named the American Liberty League and its wealthy backers. He detailed the $18,000 bribe. He detailed the plan for 500,000 soldiers. He detailed the plot to turn Roosevelt into a puppet. The congressman sat in stunned silence. It sounded like fiction, too outrageous to be real. But the man telling the story was beyond reproach. A hero with no reason to lie, who had everything to lose by coming forward. When Butler finished, he challenged them. He said, they had the power to stop this. They had the power to save democracy, but they had to be brave enough to call these men to the stand. They had to fight. The committee thanked him. They said they would investigate. But Butler knew as he walked out that the real battle was just beginning. The secret wouldn't stay secret, and when it broke, the full weight of the establishment would come crashing down. The story leaked the next morning. Someone on the committee had talked. Within hours, headlines screamed across the nation. General Butler alleges fascist plot. Plot to seize Washington exposed. Marine hero claims Wall Street conspiracy. The reaction was brutal. This wasn't the age of the internet. This was the age of radio and newspapers. And the men who owned the media were the friends of the men Butler had accused. The New York Times called it a gigantic hoax. They questioned Butler's sanity in editorials. They said he was desperate for attention. Time magazine was crueler. They called it the plot without the cream puffs. They mocked the idea that respectable bankers could be traitors. They painted Butler as a simpleton whose brain was damaged by combat. They made him a punchline. The accused men issued furious denials. Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan said it was too ridiculous to comment on. He laughed it off like someone had accused him of believing in fairies. Grayson Murphy called it an absolute lie and threatened lawsuits. Robert Sterling Clark didn't even respond. He fled to Europe to wait out the scandal in comfort. Gerald McGuire was hauled before the committee. He denied everything. He sweated through his collar on the stand. But he stuck to his story with the desperation of a man fighting for his life. It looked like the cover-up would work perfectly. The media was burying Butler. The public was confused. It was one soldier's word against the entire establishment, and in that contest, the establishment always wins. But the committee kept digging. They subpoenaed McGuire's travel records. They demanded bank records from the American Liberty League. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, and slowly, cracks appeared. They found the letters, written in McGuire's own handwriting, letters he'd sent from Europe to his bosses, letters praising Mussolini's efficiency, letters describing fascist paramilitary groups with admiration, letters proving McGuire had been exactly where Butler said, doing exactly what Butler said. They found the bank transfers, large sums moving from industrialists' accounts into slush funds McGuire controlled, money with no clear purpose, money waiting for something. They brought in Paul Comley French, the reporter who witnessed the hotel meeting. He corroborated everything under oath. He had written down McGuire's exact words, "We need a fascist government." The committee realized something terrifying. Butler wasn't crazy. He wasn't lying. He was right. On February 15, 1935, the committee released its final report. The document was a bombshell. It stated clearly, certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Read that again. The United States Congress officially confirmed a plot to overthrow the government. They confirmed Butler told the truth. They confirmed wealthy Americans committed treason. It was complete vindication. Butler had been right. He had saved American democracy. But then something strange happened. Nothing, absolutely nothing. No arrests, no trials. No one went to jail. Gerald McGuire wasn't charged with perjury. J.P. Morgan wasn't questioned. The DuPont family wasn't investigated. The American Liberty League was left alone. In published versions of the report, the names of wealthy backers were redacted, blacked out, hidden from the people. The investigation quietly closed, the file sealed. The story disappeared from newspapers. Within weeks, it was like it never happened. Why did the government let them walk? The answer is brutal pragmatism. Franklin Roosevelt was a political chess player. He knew the plot was real. He knew the names, but he also knew the country was drowning. The economy was fragile. Banks needed to lend. Factories needed to operate. The New Deal needed cooperation from industry. If Roosevelt threw captains of industry in prison, recovery could collapse. Banks might close. Factories might shut down. And Roosevelt saw something else. Across the Atlantic, storm clouds were gathering. Hitler was rearming Germany. Mussolini was invading Ethiopia. Roosevelt understood that America would eventually have to fight fascism abroad. And to do that, America needed weapons. Tanks, planes, ships, guns, ammunition. And who owned the steel mills? The DuPonts. Who owned the chemical plants? The DuPonts. Who owned the factories? The very men who tried to overthrow him. Roosevelt couldn't afford to imprison the men he needed to build the arsenal of democracy. It was a brutal calculation. Justice versus survival. He chose survival. A deal was struck, never written, never spoken, but understood. The plot would be buried. The conspirators would stay free. But in exchange, they would back off. The American Liberty League would lose its funding. Wall Street would stop destroying the New Deal. They would cooperate just enough to keep the economy moving. It was realpolitik at its most cynical. The traders went free because the country needed their factories. Smedley Butler saved democracy, but he paid the price truth-tellers always pay. He was labeled a crank, a conspiracy theorist. His reputation was damaged permanently. The establishment never forgave him for breaking the code of silence. He spent his remaining years touring the country, warning people about the military-industrial complex, about war as corporate profit, about democracy being undermined from within. But fewer people listened. The newspapers stopped covering his speeches. The crowds grew smaller. The most decorated Marine in history became a footnote, an embarrassment. He died in 1940 at age 58, just months before America entered World War II. The war he warned was coming. He died in a naval hospital in Philadelphia, the same city where the plot was hatched. He died knowing the men who tried to overthrow his country were still free, still wealthy, still powerful. His funeral was simple. No state ceremony. The president didn't attend. The general stayed away. He was buried with military honors in a small cemetery, and then forgotten. Today, the business plot is treated as a footnote, a curiosity. Most textbooks don't mention it. Most Americans never heard of it. When discussed, it's dismissed or minimized, but it's a terrifying reminder. Democracy is fragile. It can be destroyed not by foreign armies, but by the wealthy within our borders. There are always people who believe their wealth puts them above the law, who view freedom as an obstacle to profit. The greatest threat often comes not from obvious enemies, but from men in suits making secret decisions, believing they know better than the people.